Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Beat the Big Guys. Hi, I'm your host, Sandy Rosenthal. And today I'm so excited to be interviewing the author of a best-selling book that just came out this year. My guest's name is Corban Addison. Did I pronounce that right?
That's correct.
Oh, good. I forgot to check with you first before we started. My guest is Corban Addison, and I am just so delighted to have you with us. Are you calling in from Virginia?
That's correct. Yeah, Charlottesville.
Oh, what a beautiful town! What,
It
what a
is.
what a great. Is it going to be freezing cold in the next few days?
Yeah, it's going to be, I mean, like most of the country,
Yeah.
it's going to be really cold. Unfortunately, we missed getting snow. My daughter was so hoping for a white Christmas, but we just got ice and rain today, though it was right at the freezing point. It was crazy.
Oh my goodness. So, how many children do you have?
Two. My
Two.
son is 15, my daughter's 12.
15 and 12. Okay. And I'm sure the 15-year-old is happy about Christmas, but especially the 12-year-old,
Oh,
right?
yes, of course.
Yeah. Oh, it's such a lovely time of year. Well, just in case some of our listeners aren't familiar with your work, I'm going to bring them up to speed for just a moment. Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. Corban Addison is the international best-selling author of 4 novels: A Walk in the Sun, The Garden of Burning Sand, The Tears of Dark Water, which won the inaugural Wilbur Smith Adventure Writing Prize, and Harvest of Thorns. He has one work of narrative nonfiction, which is also the subject of today's episode, and that is Wastelands, the true story of farm country on trial. Corban's books have been published in more than 25 countries and address some of today's most pressing issues of justice and human rights. Corban has a law degree from the University of Virginia and an engineering degree from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Did I pronounce that right?
That's correct. Yep.
Okay, that's pretty cool, law and engineering. They really are.
Unusual. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely is unusual.
And cool. So after completing a judicial clerkship, Corban spent 6 years trying cases in the courtroom before turning to writing full time. He is a supporter of numerous humanitarian causes, including the abolition of modern slavery, forced labor, and gender-based violence. And as we've already talked about, he lived with his wife and children in Virginia. So again, welcome to Beat the Big Guys. I'm so delighted to have you with us today.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
I don't know if I can't remember if I've mentioned to our guests already, but I did read the book, Wastelands. It is a lot of detail in this book, but it's a very important story, really a David and Goliath story. And so, of course, there's a lot of detail in it. But when you have a really good writer, like we do, like we're interviewing today, it's okay. He can take lots of detail and just make it really riveting and interesting. So I'm going to turn the mic over to you, Corban, and bring our guests up to speed about the book Wastelands and the story of farm country on trial.
Sure. So Wastelands, it tells, it's really a generational story of injustice and the pursuit of justice against an industry that makes the world's bacon. It is the corporate hog industry and meat production in general, though it's focused in this case on pork. So Eastern North Carolina it's the old tobacco lands in North Carolina, and it's a very rural community of largely Black people of modest means, folks who have lived there for generations on the land. And for a long time it was just it was the tobacco lands. I mean, there were row crops. It was the sort of rural community you can imagine in a lot of different farming communities in the United States, until about the 1960s and 70s, when a local guy named Wendell Murphy, who had started a feed mill, decided to get into the hog business. And he had an idea to take Don Tyson's conception of chicken, the chicken industry. Don had basically revolutionized chickens in the 1950s by getting contracts and having other people raise his birds. Wendell Murphy decided to do the same thing with hogs. And so he created basically the contract business model for what is the modern industrial hog industry right there in Little Rose Hill, North Carolina. And so he then started handing out contracts to old tobacco farmers who were trying to keep their land, and it proliferated. The industry proliferated, going from a handful of these farms to over 2,000 by 1997. What defines an industrial hog farm, it's very different from old McDonald's farm. It's nothing like Charlotte's Web, and Wilbur. What you have is you have barns that have over 1,000 hogs, something like 1,200 hogs per barn. And on many of these farms, you have, a half dozen or a dozen barns. So you're talking about somewhere between 2,000 to 15,000 animals, in barns. They never see the sunlight, they never see the dirt. And of course, they grow really quickly because they're being fed with a special mix of sort of scientifically engineered food and antibiotics. And so they're only in the barns for, a handful of months before they go to the slaughterhouse. But in that time, they produce quite a lot of waste. I mean, hogs produce 5 times the waste of the average human being. So the industry had to deal with that waste. And the way they did it, was the cheapest way possible. So they dug big holes in the dirt that they called lagoons. They're really just a giant cesspool. And when these cesspools reach, obviously the, thousands of animals producing a lot of waste, 5 times the average human being, you're talking about, in a lot of these hog farms are producing the waste of a city of 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 humans. And it's not being processed. It's just being dumped into the cesspool. And then when they need to, they spray it out onto the land. They basically take these giant Jurassic-sized sprinklers, hook them up to the cesspool, and spray the waste. And this is just, the stuff that comes out of the hog out into the air.
And did they try to sell this to the community? It would be good for the land, to fertilizing the land.
Well, I mean, they didn't. It's interesting. I mean, they didn't try to sell it to the neighbors because the neighbors were largely in these communities people who didn't have much of a voice. They sold it to the farmers as, hey, look, you'll be fertilizing the land. Okay. And of course, waste is fertilizer, at least in its concept, in its ideal form. This is very highly concentrated waste, and it's not the greatest fertilizer in the world. And actually, in many cases, they just spray it out onto plowed dirt. But the neighbors, never really had a say in this. I mean, for them, these were their communities. They're centered typically on, a small cluster of homes. Most of the people are related in one way or another, cousins, extended family members, and then a few others that moved in through the years. Very rural communities, like I said, that have roots. I mean, in many cases, their ancestors were enslaved on this very dirt. And when they were emancipated, they were able then to acquire the land and become farmers themselves. And they then handed the land down generation upon generation until the hog industry surrounded them with these gigantic industrial hog farms and started spraying the urine and feces out onto the land directly next to many of these people's homes. So you can imagine the challenge of that. I mean, the wind drifts, under certain conditions. It basically, it's not just the stench, it's also the health effects. I mean, a lot of people have developed asthma and heart issues and depression and anxiety. There've been a lot of studies that have been done showing the effects upon these people. But the industry was making a lot of money. I mean, Wendell Murphy became a billionaire and landed on Forbes magazine's cover in 1997. I mean, this is obviously, like I said, it's making the world's bacon. And these guys became the biggest in the world. And actually then Murphy was acquired by Smithfield Foods, which is still to this day the world's largest hog producer and packer. It's now owned by a Chinese conglomerate called WH Group. It was acquired in 2013. It was the largest merger of an American and Chinese company in US history. And it raised issues in Congress. But ultimately, those issues were resolved because Americans love mergers, especially if they promise to give consumers better price on the shelf. So in the end, these neighbors, they tried for a generation to fight back. And in rural North Carolina, Black people of modest means historically and even today have much less of a voice, if any voice at all, compared to their white neighbors. Most of the industry is white. most of the farmers are white, and basically all of the politicians that had any say in this, from the local level to the state to the federal level, were white as well. And so not all of them were racist, but certainly some of them were, and that played a role in how these folks struggled to get a voice until it was 2012 and 13 when some lawyers finally decided to take their case. Basically we're talking about almost 30 years of fighting, and before these lawyers stepped in and said, there's this old claim under the English common law that America now has, and it's called nuisance. The idea is that if you're a neighbor, you can't unreasonably interfere with the use and enjoyment of your neighbor's property, whether it's, with stench or noise or whatever. There's a legal claim you can sue. So they actually brought
From dating back to
on.
England.
Yeah, back 100 years. That's right. Yeah, and in fact, ironically, in Black's Law Dictionary, the sort of the essence of nuisance is defined. I mean, there's a case, and the first case is actually against a hogsty. So, this is something that, has existed for centuries. We know that pigs stink, and neighbors, if they don't do right with your with the pigs, they can be sued under nuisance. So this was the theory. And the challenge, of course, was they had a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate on the other side, and that basically owned, the state house in North Carolina. I mean, this industry had political power such that the state was almost a company town. And I described it that way in the book. And so, there were obviously some real challenges, which I lay out in the story, and really amazing challenges that they faced with, political showdowns and with, fights in the media. And they used all sorts of trickery, in order to try to undermine the cases. I say the industry did, with its bedfellows. And
let's just call them big hog, exactly. Or big pork.
Big hog. Okay. That's right. Big pork. But these folks fought on. I mean, there were 500 plaintiffs there, in 26 communities. And these lawyers from small town North Carolina, though they had some from Texas as well, help out. They brought these cases. They had 5 federal trials. And ultimately, what I tried to do in the story is I tried to, one of my favorite books when I was a kid or a young person was A Civil Action by Jonathan Harr. Mm-hmm. It was a true life legal thriller that he told about this big environmental lawsuit. Became a big movie with John Travolta back in the 90s, sold millions of copies. And my thought was, look, if I can tell this story as a kind of true life legal thriller, it'll be far more palatable than it would otherwise, especially given the subject matter. I mean, I knew, look, hog farms, it's not the most obvious thing that people want to read about. But the beauty of the story is that it's quite dramatic in the way that it unfolded. And it really is a story of, David, fighting and actually overcoming Goliath. It's one of those rare moments where the real world lines up with the way we would tell it if it were fiction.
I agree with everything you've said. I would love to bring your book to the attention of people fighting. There's a fight going on in Louisiana, big oil. And it is well known that just as Big Hog owned the legislature in North Carolina, it's well known that the oil industry owns the legislature here in Louisiana through contributions.
I have no doubt. Yes.
I really do want to bring your book to their attention because to be used as a playbook, as a how-to, and that is something I'm going to do. In fact, I'm going to be meeting. This is being led by General Russell Honore, and I'm going to bring it to his attention tomorrow. As a matter of fact.
Wonderful.
But let's get into Wasteland. There were so many. First of all, I felt like I lived it. So many of the things that these plaintiffs endured. And that the attorneys representing the plaintiffs endured, I had to go through in my fight against the Army Corps of Engineers, who tried to cover up their mistakes. And when me and my little group started saying, "Excuse me, the federal government is responsible," we ended up being harassed, and they tried to silence us, and they did not succeed. And we did prevail, although it took a while.
Sure.
And it does take perseverance. And you have an interesting description of the word perseverance in your book, which hopefully we'll get to that. So, but I noticed on page 23, right at the beginning, you made the statement: the corporate giants have multi-million-dollar legal grist mills and delay and deny strategies. That is by far and away the number one favorite strategy of big industry, whether it be big oil, big hog, or the Army Corps of Engineers. Delay, delay, stall, stall. It's the favored strategy and technique. And for the listeners out there, always recognize that whatever excuse they're giving, that's all it is. It's stalling, and don't let them. Use the powers that you have at your disposal to not let them stall. Be it threatening them with lawsuit, but we can get into that in another episode. But don't let the big guys stall. And on page 82, the one of the characters, Don Webb, Don Webb, as I understand, used to actually be one of the hog farmers. But
He was a grower back in the 80s with Wendell Murphy, actually. Yep.
And when he came to his attention that the nuisance being caused to his neighbors, he understood that it was a real problem, and he shut his farm down.
That's correct. Yeah, he got out of the business.
He got out of the business. And and you said something really important about Mr. Webb. You said that Mr. Webb knew next to nothing about community organizing, but he saw with prophetic certainty that somebody needed to stand up.
Yep. Yeah, he did. I mean, and he just had that heart. He just decided that he needed to do it. I mean, and what he did was as simple as, as apple pie. I mean, he really didn't do anything elaborate. He just started gathering people of like mind and meeting in a local community meeting hall and talking about it. And then decided, okay, well, now we've got to take what we have to say to the State House. And they started contacting their representatives and knocking on doors and going to the State House and holding rallies. And, Don was also gifted as an orator. And I mean, he was kind of a country preacher, and he was great on the stump, and he was kind of impossible not to listen to. I mean, you just imagine that, like in, the country politician, the country preacher just sort of gets up on the stump and gathers a crowd just because he knows how to put words together and tell stories. Don told stories. He was also a minstrel. He played music. I mean, he would, at these rallies, he would bring his guitar and sing. And I mean, he just kind of had that persona, which helped, to gather folks. But it was this sort of issue nobody wanted to talk about. I mean, it just wasn't, it was, Eastern North Carolina is almost like a backwater, to the folks who, live on the glittering coast of the Outer Banks and New Bern and, or who live in the Piedmont region, which is Charlotte, or in the mountains of Asheville. I mean, when you think of North Carolina, you don't think of Duplin County. And these are folks that historically just didn't have much of a voice. They had to really fight just to get heard. I mean, even Don Webb, who was white, I mean, he had to fight just to get heard by anyone. And
thank you for explaining this. And what's critically important is Mr. Webb didn't need community organizing experience. He didn't need it. All he needed to do was speak up. And he used a gift that he had, which it just so happens he was a good orator. Yep. But the things like this is one of the things that stops people from standing up and making a difference. They feel like they need to understand and know everything and be skilled at everything. It doesn't exist.
Right.
That such a person doesn't exist. But just to stand up and speak up, and then look at the snowstorm he got going. The proverbial snowstorm that he got going.
Look, it really is a story of how community organizing happens in the real world. I mean,
in the real world.
Yeah, in the real world. Look, it's not led by any kind of person who would consider themselves a hero. I mean, and yet they are in the end, because they persevere, because they show courage, because they show up, they keep speaking, they keep fighting against all odds. and then they learn what they're good at, what they're not good at, and intelligently find people who have other gifts.
And here's the thing: once you've spoken up, people will hear him and come to him and say,
right.
"Oh, I can help you with. I can help you with." And might be an attorney willing to give him some pro bono advice, or could be a social media expert that said, "I can help you with Twitter or Instagram." So moving right along, we have so much to talk about. I don't often like to discuss threats of intimidation, because the whole point of the Beat the Big Guys is I'm trying to encourage people to come forward and speak up. And so, but I'm going to make an exception today, because you wrote about State Representative Cindy Watson in North Carolina, and apparently death threats were made against her. So what she did is she said, I have a record right here of a threat made against me, and she made this public. Right. And so there's a couple of things I want to say about that. One is that was a very smart thing to do, that she made that public. Not so much that I really think Cindy Watson needed to be concerned for her safety, but just by making it public, it showed she wasn't afraid. Yes. And the other important thing, and you discuss it again on page 140, company men, these goons that Big Oil or Big Chem or Big Pork, that these goons that they hire, they don't hide. It's because their goal is to intimidate, to make you feel nervous and to make you back off, that they're not going to actually do anything more than that. Okay,
yeah,
it happened.
I mean, no question. I mean, in most cases, it's all about intimidation, because to escalate beyond that is a crime. And, and nobody really, I mean, these companies want to do everything they can right up to the line of criminal action. And look, if they're involved in criminal action, they want to keep it under wraps, right? They're not going to, they don't want to be involved in an overt act of, criminal misbehavior, because that then, turns the table. So what they want to do is drag you through the mud, delay, deny, make you out to be a fool. And sure, use any level of non-criminal intimidation, to make you back off. And so, I'm not going to say that any pork industry person was involved in making those threats against Cindy Watson. No one knows who made them. But she did, like you said, she was a state representative, and she actually was able to take the recording. This is back in the 1990s, to take the voicemail recording into the FBI at the State House, and then march it right into a hearing in front of all of her colleagues and play it and say, I have right here, a death threat that was made against me, and I'm just putting it on the record so all of you know. Clearly, there are some people in the industry who are very unhappy about what I'm doing, but I'm not backing down. And, as it turned out, she didn't get any more threats after that. I mean, the industry did, whoever was behind those recognized they weren't going to get their way, and they stopped making them.
So I think that all of you should be paying attention to this. Threats or intimidation can happen. They did happen to me. And I think we should take note of what to do in these situations. One, recognize that that's all it is. It's a threat. And then if you can make it public that you've received a threat, do it. Okay. So moving on page 90, you talked about how Big Pork created a grassroots nonprofit to advance its agenda. And this is going on all over the country, perhaps all over the world. It's going on every day, where businesses create a group with the illusion that it just sprung out of the grass. That's what grassroots means. And that they just happened on their own, and they hide the fact that these were created by big business. And one of the things I noticed that Big Pork did is they engaged you called it a glossy PR firm, Corban, and I by a glossy PR firm, I could envision glossy 4-color flyers that they printed up and passed around. Am I right about that? pretty
Yeah, I
much.
mean, they definitely, yeah, these are professionals. They work in
Professionals,
politics.
right?
Yeah,
They
absolutely.
did TV ads, and I
Yes.
want to point something out, and about to our listeners. These things are extremely expensive. The
Yeah.
money for this stuff, the TV ads. I mean, I'm sure most of you out there have never paid for a TV ad, but you know they're expensive. You know that a TV ad on this in the Super Bowl is very, very expensive. Okay, so it should be a clue to you that when you see expensive radio ads or TV ads or expensive flyers being put out by supposedly a grassroots group, there's no way it's a grassroots group. And even though it's not illegal, it's very embarrassing if they're caught. Okay. And that's all you need to do. Just figure out a way to prove that this what was it called? NC families in your book,
Yeah,
Corbin,
right.
NC
Yeah, and some
families.
farm families. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
They,
mean, it came out. It was fortunate that they were able to bring out some documents in the case that
yeah.
revealed that
Yes.
the industry's funding connection, because it didn't look
Yes.
like, on the surface, it didn't look like the industry was behind it, but it turned out that the industry's
Oh,
hands were all over it.
Oh, I loved reading about that. And apparently, Big Hog also created a nonprofit just to disseminate this story. Family farmers are under siege by hog haters, which I guess are vegetarians and
Right.
environmentalists
Radical environmentalists. That's
and
that's what I was
lawyers.
saying that.
Okay, so again, it's not illegal. It's nothing illegal about it. But if they're
Sure.
caught, it's extremely embarrassing.
Yep.
Really, it looks bad.
Yep.
Just and one of the things, and if we get a chance, we'll talk about it later. One of the things that big industry protects with all its might is its reputation, its goodwill. Okay. And anything that hurt that goodwill, they're going to work hard to not let that happen. You made a great statement on page 134. Industry will not reform itself, only brute force will.
Yeah,
Any
no
comment on
question. I
that?
mean, oh, sure. I mean, look, it's all because of money. I mean, money rules the world. And the longer that I've, worked on telling stories about injustice, the more convinced that I've become that, I mean, if you follow the money, you will, in almost every case, find an explanation for, the evil that's occurring. It really is, sadly, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil in the world. And we've seen it in so many different industries. So, in this case, you've got an industry who's answering to shareholders and who is answering to, the ultimate persuasion of the almighty dollar. And they are going to do everything they can to maximize their profit and minimize their expenses. They're going to do so all the way up to the line of, of what is acceptable from a regulatory and criminal standpoint. And then, they're going to, if there's a gray area, they'll live in it. If there's a way to deny what they're actually doing, they absolutely will. I mean, if there's a way to lie to the public without making it appear that they're lying, they will. I mean, this is just, this par for the course. Industry does not, unfortunately, does not in most cases, in almost any case, exist for the good of the public. It exists for its own good. And the law is, I mean, look, I'm a lawyer. I believe in the power of the law. The law exists to actually rein in the worst instincts of individuals, of human beings, whether, individual or collective. And if the law is working, it reins in industry. I mean, if regulators are doing their job and regulations are adequate, then you can actually have an industry get reined in and, take care of their, the environment and the people that they're working for them and the people in the neighborhoods around them and everyone else. But sadly, we live in a world in which, the people who make the laws are also subject to the same sort of instincts and are very often being, their elections are being bankrolled by these industries. So when you have that kind of, corporate capture in legislatures, especially at the state level, you have scenarios in which, it's very difficult to reform an industry outside the courthouse. And that's really what Wastelands teaches, if it teaches anything.
And it does you do a very good job of explaining it. But I have hope from it. If it can happen in North Carolina, it can hopefully happen in Louisiana and other places in the country. So on page 79, you talked about how Smithfield hired people to shadow and report the folks who were gathering information and and doing research for this lawsuit, and which I thought was interesting. These company people.
Yeah, well, there were lawyers that hired some investigators that were shadowing folks.
Right.
It wasn't always clear who was, behind all of that, but definitely, and then when people would go down east, which is what they call Eastern North Carolina, if
Down
you were
east,
not
yeah.
from there, when you go down east, like you're entering another world. They would always get shadowed. I mean, every
Right.
single time they would show up in those areas around the hog farms and they would pick up a tail. I mean, every single lawyer had a story, young, old, whatever, and it happened frequently. And again, it was an intimidation tactic. It was
Right.
also a surveillance tactic. They wanted to
Right.
know where they were. They wanted them to know also that they knew, that the industry knew they were there.
So the two things interesting about that. One, it definitely is an intimidation tactic. But two, keep in mind, this was private industry, and private industry can hire people to shadow and report. They can do that. I mean, it's their prerogative. It's their shareholders' money. But there's somebody who can't do that, and that is your government. So if any of you out there see that you're being shadowed by people who are working for the government, that is not okay, because that's taxpayer money. Okay. And you can stand up and fight against that. So and anybody wants to know more about that, just call me, because I know, because it's happened to me. So, this is really, really interesting. On page 269, you talked about how this legislation, they were trying to pass legislation to weaken the lawsuit. Do I have that right? Weaken how strong the teeth of the lawsuit. And it was couched as, if you don't vote for this legislation, you must be a bad person. What's really, 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 really interesting, that's how this legislation was being marketed and promoted. If you don't vote for it, you must be a bad person. And all of you out there, if you ever see legislation where that's how it's being supported, beware. Why not discuss the merits of the legislation? Why do you have to talk about the voters? There's a reason. So that's almost like a, what do you call it? A bellwether, or ding ding. Beware. If you ever see legislation being promoted that way, there's a reason, because the legislation's got no merit.
Look, and
Do you
there's
care to add?
no, look, this is a classic tactic of industry. When they're losing in the courthouse, they go to the state house, they go to Congress, and they try to change the law. They try to redefine a law. So in this case, the industry was, they had not yet suffered a loss at trial, but they saw that the case was proceeding toward trial. They had basically gotten through all the discovery. They were at what was called the summary judgment phase, which is right before trial. And they went to the legislature in this kind of, underhanded way, and asked their friends, that were funded by industry and that were definitely, their buddies. I mean, to try to change the 400-year-old definition of nuisance in midstream, and not just apply it to future cases, but to actually apply it to the existing cases and before trial, which would have undercut them. I mean, had they changed the definition of the law, these cases would never have seen a jury. They were actually trying to take away the right of these neighbors to have their day in court after they had sued, which is seriously unconstitutional and never would have stood up on appeal. At the same time, it would have stopped the trials, and it may very well have kept them from ever happening, simply because it's so expensive. Once you're that far along, to stop and then start over. And so they came within 2 votes. I mean, it's really the story that I tell in those chapters is kind of hard to believe that it happened in America, and yet it did. But it's a great example of what it takes to fight back against this kind of underhanded subterfuge by industry in the political way, in the political space, which is, you've got to find friends, you've got to find allies, you've got to figure out how to build an alliance, even of people that you wouldn't ordinarily like or support, You've got to find a way to appeal to enough people to say, yeah, you've got a point. We don't like this. And in this case, this was a great example of, so I not to get partisan here, but in North Carolina, they have a very they have what's called a Republican supermajority and have for some time. And that just means that they have a veto proof. They can pass veto proof legislation because the governor, who's a Democrat, even if he vetoes it, they can override his veto. They've got a supermajority. So in this case, industry's bedfellows were all Republicans from down east. And if the Republicans all voted as a party bloc, then this law change, this rule change would have happened. And so what they had to do, when I say the plaintiffs' lawyers had to do, is they had to carve off a block of Republicans and say, who would vote against this rule change, against industry, in favor of the neighbors. And they were able to do that by figuring out, okay, well, actually, a lot of these conservatives are very, pro property rights. And this is a property rights case. And everybody, who owns a piece of property has neighbors, and everybody wants to be treated fairly by their neighbors. So if you construe it like that, they realized, oh, we can peel off this group of Republicans who, have a conscience and have property and care about the property rights of the neighbors down east, and recognize also, they were able to portray it. Hey, this law that they're trying to pass is for one company, one industry. It's not for the people of North Carolina. This is not designed to benefit North Carolinians writ large. This is designed to benefit one multi-billion-dollar company. How can we possibly do that? Right? So they were able to spin the argument in such a way that they carved off this group of conscientious Republicans who saved the day. Like, they turned into the heroes in the legislature. It's a really great example of how we, when it comes to politics, you kind of have to find a way to make friends with all sorts of different folks.
That's very, very true. The no one person or a small group can get a huge job done. Allies is absolutely critical. So I'm actually wrapping up on my final thing that I wanted to discuss in your book, and it was actually my most favorite thing in the entire book, and it's right at the very end of the book, and it's on page 341. And on that page, you talked about the state of North Carolina's junior senator, Tom Tillis. Tom Tillis made the most incredible statement. He said, "We need to prove to the people on the other side that we're bigger than them, and we're going to stop them." You notice what, and of course, to remind our listeners, Tom Tillis was on Big Hog's side. Tom Tillis was trying to protect the hogmen. Okay. We need to show them we're bigger. You notice he didn't say we're right or we're compassionate. We're bigger. That so encapsulates what every big guy out there, big pork, big chem, big oil, and there's a big out there in almost every way, shape, or form. But you notice they talked about they're big, and they somehow think, and you worded it very well, Corban, they think their walls will hold just because they're big. And as you said on page 370, those walls are a fortress of arrogance. And they don't see it. They don't see it. And I'm going to wrap up what I want to say now, and then we'll get back to Corban. And really what's going on is these big guys, they're all no different from your bully on the 4th grade playground. They think just because they're bigger, they're better or righter. But these bullies have two big flaws. They're not smarter. And they have that arrogance that they have low self-esteem, and they're petrified of anything happened to hurt their image that they have out there. And they're all the same. All these big guys are the same. And when I read what Tom Tillis said, we're bigger. So that's only needed. We're not right. We're not compassionate. We're just big. So I'm gonna. This is my favorite part of your book because that. Well, the whole book is great. Don't get me wrong, but that really encapsulated what it took me interviewing 50 different people who had beat the big guys in their own way. I realized all these big guys are no different from the bully on the fourth grade playground.
Yeah, no question. And what's amazing about that same day is that at the same time that Tillis was saying that, the jury was deliberating in the third federal trial, excuse me, and actually came out with a historic verdict. I mean, so you have 12 ordinary citizens who, empowered by the law to weigh the facts, actually came out and said, no, actually, it doesn't matter how big, your industry is, Tom. What matters here is the truth of what actually happened and what the law says is just. And guess what? You guys lose. So, and look, I mean, I remember when I was learning about that event, the fact that happened on the same day as this giant rally with 1,000 people and all these bigwigs from the industry and politics came together in the same town, right across, the city from the courthouse. And the jury was deliberating and came in with this historic verdict. I mean, I was like, you can't make that up. I mean, that's the sort of thing you'd put in a movie if you were telling it as fiction. I mean, and that really.
And they were shell shocked.
Yeah,
you described them walking around like, oh, yes. I love the way you described all the attorneys flew out of the courtroom like finches that have been disturbed. Like, that was a great image.
Scared out of a book. Yes, exactly.
Finches out of a book. Yeah, you're right. It was a fabulous ending to an incredible story with people that I feel like I know them. I feel like I understand that Miss Elsie passed away recently, but I feel like I know her. You did a great job of helping us get to know the characters. I mean, actually, no, the real life people,
yes,
not right. Actors in a show. So
yeah, exactly. I mean, it was a privilege, really. I mean, the joy of telling a story like this is that, these people, I actually became deep, very good friends with them. And we've lost, like I mentioned before, at the outset, we've lost a couple of the plaintiffs recently. And, I grieved personally at their loss. I mean, because they'd become friends of mine and people that I cared deeply about, the lawyers, the legal teams, the various activists, the hog farmer that testified at all 5 trials against his own interest and at great, at great risk to himself. Tom Butler, I became, dear friends with him. I mean, all these folks are beautiful people, and I was a privilege to tell their story.
Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our listeners and to help them beat the big guys in their own communities?
I've just spent a lot of time in my life. I've written numerous books about social change, and a lot of people, I think, are sort of misunderstand how it happens. And I've come to realize that really there's one way in which, the world changes. And that's when, a group of people with lots of different talents and passions, come together in common cause around something that needs to happen and persist. I mean, people who find a way to use, and then they learn how to use the levers of existing power. They don't create a new system. They find out how to use the levers that exist in systems in order to force whoever is keeping the world the same and entrenching the injustice to change. So, I mean, I love, what you talked about in your own story. I mean, Wasteland is a classic blueprint example of how, the world can change using the levers of power in existing systems when you bring together the right kind of coalition. And that can be done in any kind of context. But as you point out, I mean, there are a lot of reasons why the world, and the existing sort of infrastructure is entrenched. It's very hard to dislodge it. So you have to be willing to fight for a long time, and you have to be willing to put your reputation, on the line and take risks. But if you believe enough, and if you have the right sort of people behind you and figure out how to use the levers of power to your advantage, like, the world can change for the better.
a close advisor of mine points out, just to the only thing I can add to that is when you're fighting, big hog, big chem, big pork, for them it's a job, it's a punch clock. They go home at night. But for you, for Miss Elsie, it was her life, it was it was her property, it was her home. She didn't punch a time clock. And for people like them who banded together and found some attorney to take the case, that's how they win. That's how
Absolutely.
they win. So thank you so much, Corban Addison, author of Wasteland, the true story of farm country on trial. And thank all of you, the listeners, for being with us today. Please like, subscribe, and rate this podcast on all of your favorite platforms. And remember, no matter who you are, you too can beat the big guys. And stay with me, Corban. I'm just going to stop recording.